Thank you. Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I move the motion standing in Senator Fifield's name that the Senate notes the failure of the Gillard government to live within its means or to develop a coherent fiscal strategy. Madam Acting Deputy President, the Labour Party in government does not know how to manage money. They manifestly do not know how to live within their means. In their first 4 budgets, they spent $172 billion more than they raised in revenue. And of course this year was supposed to be the year, the first time since 1989 when a Labour government was going to deliver a surplus budget. But of course, sure enough, in the shadow of Christmas, while the Treasurer was hoping that Australians were distracted and starting to focus on some Christmas cheer and end-of-year celebrations, he snuck out there and he gave a press conference and he finally fessed up to what everyone across Australia already knew, and that was that this government would not be delivering a surplus in 2012-13 either. This Labour government does not know how to manage money. This Labour government does not know how to live within its means. This is a government that spends too much, which is why they're always casting around for more cash, which is why they're always looking for more new Labour Party taxes, which is why we are yet again talking about increased taxes on people's superannuation savings. And the government will say, well, we've got very difficult circumstances. And yes, there was a global financial crisis. However, you've got to look at our circumstances here in Australia. Firstly, the Labour government in 2007 inherited a very strong budget position. No government net debt, $70 billion worth of Commonwealth net assets, a $20 billion surplus. And of course we are here in the Asia-Pacific, a very strongly growing part of the world. Australia, in the first 4 years of this Labour government, benefited from the best terms of trade in 140 years. And if you look at other resource-based economies around the world, they've all been delivering surplus budgets. And they're all in a much stronger fiscal position than Australia under the administration of both the Rudd and Gillard governments. And not only did they inherit a strong budget position with no government net debt, with a $20 billion surplus, with $70 billion worth of Commonwealth net assets, not only did they benefit from the best terms of trade in 140 years because we are a resource-based economy and because we are in the Asia-Pacific, right at the heart of a rapidly growing part of the world, they also imposed 27 new or increased Labour Party taxes. 27 new or increased Labour Party taxes so far. And of course, you would remember, Madam Acting Deputy President, that last week the Prime Minister gave a speech to the National Press Club. And in her speech, there was no coherent economic strategy on how to grow Australia's economy more strongly. Nothing. There were only 2 things in the Prime Minister's speech. The 2 things in the Prime Minister's speech was an election date of 14 September and an assertion that somehow the Australian people are not paying enough tax. It was a clear threat. Because, of course, the problem that the Prime Minister has got, the problem that the Treasurer has got, is that not only has Labor spent $172 billion more than they've raised in revenue in their first 4 years, they've already made $120 billion in unfunded election commitments. So here we have it. We've got a government that spent too much. We've got a government that is always desperate for more cash, always casting around for another tax grab, and yet it is still not enough. They still haven't been able to balance the books, and they've made so many additional promises they need more cash. So here we've got the Prime Minister letting the cat out of the bag at the same time as she's announcing the election date. In the next budget, the Prime Minister says there will be some tough decisions. Some tough decisions, the Prime Minister says. And we, of course, know exactly that tough decisions from a Labour Prime Minister like Ms Gillard is code for more Labour taxes. And, of course, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, spin doctors out of the Treasurer's office, spin doctors out of Mr Shorten's office have been busily backgrounding the press gallery, trying to make the case that somehow there ought to be increased taxes on people's superannuation savings. Now, that's not quite the way they put it. The way the Labour Party puts it, when they want to come up with a new tax, they essentially go out there and they try and demonise a group of Australians that they're about to hit with a new tax. Usually the words they use, they say there are some rich people out there that are taking advantage of some perk that they don't deserve. That is the modus operandi. Remember in their first budget. In their first budget, we had the luxury car tax, and the Treasurer went out and said, well, this is a tax on the rich. This is a tax on Australia's Maserati drivers. This is a tax on Australia's Ferrari drivers. Don't you worry, aspirational middle class. This won't be a tax that you'll have to pay. I'd forgotten. But guess what? Guess what? Over the last 4 years, who has paid most of the revenue that came from those increased luxury car taxes? Who? It is families across Australia buying a new family station wagon or the like. Right. Because, of course, this government, while they have a political strategy to demonise the supposedly rich, because that is what they want to do for their political purposes, when it comes down to it, their tax increases invariably hurt low and middle income earners. And of course, so it is now with superannuation. People there out of Mr Shorten's office and the Treasurer's office have been out there busily trying to make the case that there are all these rich Australians who are taking advantage, avoiding tax, quasi-dodging tax by taking advantage of tax concessions that are available to those Australians who are doing the right thing by saving to achieve a self-funded retirement. That's what we've had. And of course, the first thing that the government was looking at, and the spin doctors out of Mr Shorten's office and the Treasurer's office were quite upfront about that as they were backgrounding off the record, that the Labor Party wanted to tax super payment for over 60s if those payments were taken as a lump sum in the range of $800,000 to $1 million. Now, the Prime Minister was shamed into ruling that out, because she could see that the outcry across Australia from people who've been doing the right thing was so significant. Even Labor people, even people like former Senator Nick Sherry, a highly reputable contributor to the superannuation policy debates over a very long time, even Labor's own people started to attack this government for the tax grabs that they were considering, and of course the Prime Minister was shamed into ruling that particular tax grab out. But that won't stop them from going down the list of all of their other increased tax options that they're currently considering. They are looking at taking more money away from super savers by fiddling with the transition to retirement arrangements. They're looking at lowering concessional contribution caps even further. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, today, if a Labor government that looks at doing these sorts of things to Australians doing the right thing by saving for their own retirement should at least be across the facts. And today I asked the leader of the Labor Party in the Senate, I asked the Prime Minister's representative in the Senate, I asked the leader of the government in the Senate whether he was aware how much tax people saving for their retirement paid on any contribution to superannuation above $25,000 a year. And you know what? The Minister didn't know. Senator Shorten didn't know. You think that a government that was considering whacking on another tax would at least know the facts. Because, of course, when we talk about concessional contribution caps, when we talk about the 15% tax rate that applies to those Australians who make contributions up to $25,000 in a year, that's not a perk. And people that are saving $25,000 are not rich people. People that are that 15% tax rate is an incentive to encourage people to save more now, to lock their money away for 20, 30, 40 years until they retire, so that it is available for them in retirement, along with the earnings on those funds invested. But of course, I mean, this government has already reduced those concessional contribution caps down from $50,000 and $100,000 down to $25,000. Because, why? Because the government was desperate for more cash. They wanted people who were saving more voluntarily to superannuation to pay more tax. That's what this is all about. They want Australians saving for their retirement to pay the price for their wasteful spending. Because they can't balance the books, because they can't live within their means, because they've had $172 billion worth of accumulated deficits, because they've already got $120 billion in additional unfunded spending commitments, they've got to go after savers across Australia and put their hand into their pocket and try and get some more out of it. Because, of course, there's this $1.34 trillion pot of money. There are $1.34 trillion worth of super savings invested in superannuation, and the Labor Party thinks we want a bigger share of it. Why? Because this Labor Party in government doesn't know how to manage money, because they don't know how to live within their means, and they have failed to develop a coherent fiscal strategy. But, Madam Acting Deputy President, there's more. Not only has this Labor government considered imposing a tax on super payments for the over 60s, not only are they looking at taking more money away from super savers by fiddling with the transition to retirement arrangements, not only are they looking at lowering concessional contribution caps even further, I put it to you that the government right now is looking at scrapping the government superannuation co-contribution for low-income earners completely. Because, of course, even though this Labor Party promised before the 2007 election that they would make no change to superannuation, ever since, over the last 5 years, the Treasurer, Mr. Swan, has cut government super co-contribution benefits for low-income earners by more than $3.3 billion. And anyone who is interested in the detail, I've got a printout here. I've got the list of all of the measures in budget after budget, mid-year economic and fiscal outlook after mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. Now let me just repeat. This government, this Labor government, has cut government super co-contribution benefits for low-income earners by more than $3.3 billion so far. And I've got absolutely no doubt that people in Mr. Shorten's office and people in the Treasurer's office are looking at this yet again to make further cuts. And of course the other thing that I'm led to believe Mr. Shorten and the Treasurer are looking at is to lower the threshold from which the increased 30% contribution tax would apply. You know, that is the measure that was in the last budget. In the last budget, the government said they would impose a 30% tax on contributions for anyone earning more than $300,000. Now, by the way, that was supposed to come into effect on 1 July 2012. We haven't seen any legislation yet because the government is too incompetent even to process their tax grabs through this parliament. You know why? Because they haven't found out a way yet on how to sort out the implications for politicians and public servants. Because they're embarrassed that they're out there imposing one rule on Australians out there while living by another rule for themselves. They're quite quick at imposing additional taxes and cutting benefits for low-income earners, for the middle class. They're not quite as quick when it comes to actually imposing additional hardship on themselves. And of course, the other thing that I'm absolutely convinced about is that whatever Labor says before the election, after the next election, a re-elected Labor government would scrap the low-income super tax offset, because Labor cannot afford it. Whatever their rhetoric before the election, every time they do the opposite after the election. Remember the promise in 2007, we won't make any change to superannuation. And in successive budgets, the Treasurer cut concessional contribution caps, pushing up the tax people have to pay that save more. They cut the super co-contribution benefits for low-income earners by more than $3 billion. In total, they have imposed more than $8 billion in additional taxes on those Australians doing the right thing by saving for their retirement. Australians doing the right thing by trying to get themselves into a position where they can look after their own retirement needs rather than to be a burden on the public purse. And of course, we know that there is more to come because all of these tax grabs in the past weren't enough. And of course, the reason Labor will have to scrap the low-income super tax offset if re-elected is because they've attached it to the minerals resource rent tax. And what a fiasco that was. I mean, only a Labor Treasurer can come up with a complex new tax targeting an important industry for our nation, which doesn't hardly raise any revenue at all. In fact, only the Labor Party can come up with a complex new tax targeting an important industry for Australia, which leaves the budget worse off. I mean, right now, the government has spent more on administering the minerals resource rent tax than what it has raised in revenue. I mean, it is just a complete joke. It is just a complete fiasco. I mean, yes, Minister gave us the hospital without patients, Slim Dusty gave us the pub with no beer, and Mr. Swan gave us a shrinking secret mining tax with no revenue. I mean, how incompetent do you have to be? I mean, no wonder this government cannot live within its means. No wonder that this government is all over the place when it comes to its fiscal and economic strategy. I mean, the mining tax is a complex, distorting, highly inefficient, costly to administer, costly to comply with tax, which hardly raises any revenue at all, when the government has already spent all of the money they thought it would raise and more. And guess what? Because everyone in the Labor Party is so embarrassed about what a mess Mr. Swan have made of the mining tax that they're scrambling around wanting to cover up the costly consequences of his incompetence. I mean, here he is. He's come up with a complex new tax. The ATO is spending more than $50 million to administer it so far. Smaller miners are spending more than $20 million complying with it so far to prove that they actually don't have to pay it. It hasn't raised any revenue at all, hardly. Not any meaningful revenue at all. Certainly the three biggest miners who signed the deal with the government haven't paid any mining tax at all. Clearly, everyone from the Prime Minister down in the Labor Party is severely embarrassed. So what do they do when people ask, well, how much revenue have you raised? They duck for cover. And you know what they tell us? They say we're not allowed to know how much it is because it's secret. If we told you how much revenue this tax had raised, somebody would have to go to jail. I mean, that is the advice that just was tabled by the government earlier today. Like if somebody from the ATO told the Treasurer how much his failed mining tax had raised, that tax officer would have to go to jail. How ridiculous is that? I mean, a government that comes up with a new tax, that makes predictions on how much it's going to raise, that spends all the money they think it's going to raise, should be accountable on whether or not it has raised what they predicted at budget time it would. That is basic common sense. That is basic accountability of the executive government to the parliament. But not this government. Not this government. They say, you're not entitled to this. This is secret. So I say it again. This is a government that has made a complete mess of things, from the Prime Minister down, but the weak link, I would say, in particular, is the Treasurer. Because it was the Treasurer that stuffed up the initial mining tax, it was the Treasurer that stuffed up the second version of the mining tax, and I've got to say, if I was Mr. Rudd, I'd be rather upset. Because it was Mr. Swan who made a mess of the mining tax, and it was Mr. Rudd who got the sack. It was Mr. Swan who stuffed up the mining tax, and while Mr. Rudd got the sack, he got a promotion. He got a promotion. But this government has made a complete mess of things. This Treasurer has made a complete mess of our budget. He's made a complete mess of the mining tax. And if he had any decency, he would resign.